that the body hung from the springs. And before, most of the bodies had been attached to the shafts, and you got all of the trot bounce transferring from the horse. So they were looking for ways to make the body float. And you'll see several examples of that. And then they described that the body, the floor was generally at or near the level of the shafts. So you can see where the shafts go, the floor of each of these vehicles is really close to that. And Gloria, would you start with this?
Yeah, I'll start with this vehicle because this is probably the oldest one in the lineup. And this is the predecessor to America using many of the leaf or metal springs. And it is patterned after some of the very earliest of vehicles because they hadn't developed springs or suspensions on vehicles in the very early days because they had no roads or unimproved roads. And so what they did is they suspended the bodies originally from chains that were off some upright members on the undercarriage. So the chains, the body was free to sway around. And then they started using leather. And this vehicle is an early vehicle that is suspended on leather or like a thoroughbrace, like our original Concord coaches would have been. Many of you are familiar with the Concord coach. And the reason for this suspension was that the roads were not very improved and the body is independent from the undercarriage. And if you can see, the body is hung on the thoroughbrace. Can you see it's not the shafts are not attached to the body. So this is where the concept came for the gig, in that you would sit the gig on the springs and not connect the body necessarily to the shafts. Because if you know in a carriage like a Meadowbrook or a road cart, when the horse moves, your movement is up and down and up and down and up and down. Well, this avoids some of that, and they also, if you notice with this vehicle, it has what we call sway straps on it. In other words, if the body is not suspended from or attached to the shafts, it can vote not forward and backward, but it can go side to side. So these sway straps that are on the side prevent it from going too far to one side and too far to the other side. Jerry, maybe I'll ask you to talk about the cantilevered back of this carriage.
Yep. The engineering of this vehicle was as early as 1760, perhaps, and this probably is about an 1840 carriage, built about 1840. You distinguish that, well, for one thing, there was no hickory available in England. So the carriage builders in England used big, massive oak pieces for their fellies and so forth, where in America they began to use hickory. Well, this piece of wood is the spring for this vehicle. So it's called a cantilever spring, and it's made of hickory. And that was one of the benefits of American wood products. If you find one of these in your barn, if it's pre-1800, it'll have a notch in this hub and a pin that drops through like a cotter pin, only it's bigger, that holds that wheel on. So to get the wheel off, you had to turn the wheel to the right spot, pull the pin out, and then take it off. And it was called a lynch pin. So that's how we dated these vehicles. Was about 1800 they made that change. These ride very comfortably. One thing I was telling Gloria, when you drive one of these with the thoroughbraces, if your horse is not accustomed to it, he takes that first step, the body swings, and he sometimes will hesitate to take the second step because he's getting a counter load. But it's a beautiful vehicle.
The other thing you can notice on this vehicle is some of the French influence, because we always wanted to emulate the Europeans. And one of the things that's very characteristic of a lot of the French vehicles are these types of tooling that you can see here. Can you see this little round decorative thing? And if you'll notice the step is very fanciful. and it's got extra curves or things on it. So they tried to do those kinds of things to let people think maybe it was a French vehicle, but this was very American to have it this way with a cantilevered seat or spring in the back and the thoroughbrace on the front. Now, if you want to go to what you folks probably more typically see in the show ring of the gig, is one that's like this. It's probably called a Stanhope gig with a very rounded body. So the gig over here, I don't know whether you can see, it has a kind of a square box body. Can you see that? Can you see also, Jerry talked about the fact that the shafts are at the level of the floorboard. Can you see that in most of these other gigs that have springs on them? And this square type body with the louvers in the side is called a Part 8 gig. So this is a Part 8 gig. It still has what they characteristically call Stanhope pillars on the side, which is the front part of the seat near the skirt of the seat. You see the red panel that comes up? Those are called Stanhope pillars. So some people might call it a Stanhope, but a Stanhope more characteristically has a rounded body. Okay. Now, this vehicle also is set on telegraph springs. Telegraph springs or platform springs were the type of springs that a coach would be positioned on. There would be a set of telegraph springs under the front of the coach body and the back of the coach body. And the coach actually was positioned on top of those telegraph springs, just like this body is positioned on the top of this single set of telegraph springs. Telegraph springs have springs that go in 4 directions. They come up in the front and curve down on the side. Can you see the springs, the heavy, and again they're called leaf springs. And so with these other vehicles, we'll examine them. No other carriage here has a full set of telegraph springs underneath it, but this one does, okay? Now, if you also trace this around, the body is not attached to the shafts. So if you have a chance a little later to walk around this, because this is a very pure gig, in that the shafts can be traced all the way around this entire body, and the body doesn't sit, is not at all connected to the shafts. So this body is independent. Can you see? It's independent from the undercarriage. It wiggles a little. But what happened is these springs added maybe 150 pounds to the weight of the carriage. So the lightweight carriage is, guess what? The one on leather. A Concorde coach weighs about 2,000 pounds. One of my English coaches that are set on, the body set on 2 sets of telegraph springs or platform springs, that weighs about 3,000 pounds. The golden carriage that was down in the museum, the arm roaster, weighs 4,000 pounds. So that'll give you an indication of the weight of the springs on in carriages. Now, these stiff springs are not very good on no roads or rough roads, because it will shake the body of an English coach apart. So that's why these leather suspensions preserve the body. So this was meant to drive more when we had roads. So we needed a flat surface, we needed gravel or macadam roads, and then we could start using these carriages more once we had lots of roads and bridges. Now, the other unique thing about this carriage is it has what we call, now it has what we call a cricket. This is called a cricket because this elevates the floor for short people like myself. And then let's say if we would dragster, where is he? He's not here. If he were here going to drive this, we'd take this out for him, and I would sit beside him, but with this in place, I have got proper platform to brace my body with. Now, the other, I'm trying to think what else. This has got proper gig lamps on it as well. Gig lamps are generally characterized. Now, when we talk about carriages, we have to say generally, maybe, sometimes, or the manufacturer called it a gig, but it's not really a gig, or he called it a Fiat and it's really a brake or something else. So we have to be careful and not give too emphatic rules and regulations. But generally, gig lamps do not have a high chimney on them. They have a round front, and they have square or rectangular sides on them here. Now, they may or may not, generally gig lamps did not have a red reflector in the back because they were very formal vehicles, and you weren't expected to be out too much at night with them, but they were a vehicle to show off your horses, and generally used very animated horses with gigs, and they could either be sporty, casually turned out or formally turned out. Is there any other thing? Oh, this has full male axles. Oh, go ahead. You talk about that.
That's okay. The Stanhope gig is so similar to this that on the first look you would think this was a Stanhope gig. The differences that you can usually count on is on a Stanhope gig, most of the time this box here would have spindles. It just made them a little bit lighter. The axles on this are male axles. This wheel will not come off. If you take everything loose and it breaks everything, it will not come off because it's bolted. These bolts go all the way through a steel plate back here that turns on the axle, and that was a male requirement because they didn't want the male coaches losing wheels going across Europe. Generally, if you see a monogram on these, I had one that had the Vanderbilt monogram on it, and it's always right here. That Stanhope pillar is where they would have put the monogram on it. This is a gorgeous vehicle. They ride so nicely. Do you mind if I...
No, not at all. Not at all.
They ride so nicely, they absorb so much of the horse's action that you can do this. See how the shaft can move and the body doesn't.
You see that? That fun?
A quick question.
Yeah.
If you see the male axle, can you assume it's English?
No. Because Brewster did male axles. This company, who made this carriage, Mindy?
French Carriage Company.
The French Carriage Company of Boston made this. So this is a very American vehicle. The only European vehicle here is the natural wood rally car up there. That's the only European. That's made in England. And oftentimes you can tell the English vehicles because they have the connectors where your keyhole traces are attached to the vehicle look like pigtails. They're squiggly things that look like pigtails, and the British did that a great deal. Yeah.
And they swung the single tree underneath more on the British ones, I think we got.
On the British ones, is that right? Yeah.
I mean, our British ones.
Yeah. On the American ones or the English ones?
And this one does have a drop.
This has a drop one. Yeah.
But
yeah.
that's more common on the British.
Yeah. Now the other thing, this is, yeah, go ahead.
You know why they had those curly pigtail things? Because they usually train.
They had chain and traces. You're listening to Holly? Holly's very British, just like that carriage is very British. So Holly would know. So with chain and traces, the handsome cabs had them. A lot of the commercial vehicles did. They had chain and traces, and they were much easier to adjust to different size horses because the chain links were sometimes that long. So you had all these different adjustments that you could do across these pigtail attachments on the carriage. Now the other thing this carriage is set up for, it looks to me, what do we got? We've got a little bit of, we've got two sets of footman loops. We've got some footman loops here, but we've also got some larger ones here. And these are set up for what we call a false breeching. Because of having these tug stops here, this helps to slow the carriage down, or if you ever did rein back with it. But sometimes, and most of the time, we like to drive our horses with as little harness on as possible, so you can see the beauty of the round curves of the buttocks of the horse and all of that sort of thing. So this carriage is set up so if you don't want to use a typical box breeching, I think it's called, our typical breeching that we use on a single horse vehicle, you could actually do a heavy leather strap through here from this shaft to the other shaft, so when the horse went to hold back going downhill, that strap would come up against his haunches in the back and slow the carriage down. So it's set up for a false breeching as well. And if you want to know about breeching, go to the draft horse. The draft horse people have all different types of breeching and names associated with them too. So you can go there and look at that. What else, Jerry?
This was the choice vehicle for horse shows back at the turn of the century. This and the Stanhope gig were used for that so much, and that's one reason they didn't want the breeching on the horse. They were in the Madison Square Garden to show off their stallion or their finest bloodstock, and they wanted as little harness as possible. In studying the Brewster records from 1895 to about 1905, there are many records where Brewster was to deliver Stanhope gigs to Madison Square Garden, and one of them says deliver it 30 minutes before the show, before the show class. And I thought, you know, that's cutting it pretty close if you're doing that. But these were very popular show vehicles.
Now, everybody always wants to know about the curved shafts. Well, the curved shafts were for 2 or 3 different reasons. One of the things that the curved shafts can do is allow the body to sit lower on to the axle. And if you'll notice how the distance between the axle and the body here is very close. Now look at the 2 gigs on the end over there. You see how high that body is? So you could drive a single to a pair. Generally, the higher the seat is, the more horses you drive. Because if you're driving a tandem, you want to sit high enough to see your lead horse, okay? So you can see this sweeping shafts here, attached to the tugs in the side of the horse's harness. They sweep down, so it lowers the body. So this is a lot easier for me to get into than the second one. So the girls gave me the good vehicle first to get into. But well, yes, because your center of gravity is lower. Yes, exactly. So the lower your center of gravity is, that's why we women can sit a horse better than men can, you know that. We have a lower center of gravity because of our hips for giving birth. I mean, we just are built that way. And you guys have all this muscle on top. Well, you can tip off a horse easily with muscle on top. You can get off balance and all that sort of thing. So that's the fun part. Now the other thing, you can tell a really well-made gig, it will have metal reinforcement. Now they steam bend these shafts, but they have metal reinforcement, and if you come up and examine this a little bit later, you can see that there's actually some bolts that go through here that are holding the wood shaft, the curved shaft, to this metal structure that's running all up, all underneath this entire piece. Now, on some of the other ones, for instance, the Boston Shays, there is no metal running under it. That's steam bent, those shafts are on the Boston Shays, but there's no metal underneath it. So they really wanted to lighten the carriage because obviously this metal would have added weight to the carriage as well. Okay, where is, yeah, go ahead.
Another quick question relative to those shades. If you got a much older, like, 100-year-old carriage, can you assume that those shafts might be brittle and easily broken as a pair of
Yes, you can assume that. Yes. In fact, I'm noticing there's a slight crack on one of the shafts there. but it's our determination that Emily won't go astray today when she drives it. She's going to drive that vehicle at 4:30 this afternoon for her proficiency test. So if you want to come and see that put to one of the gray horses, come back at 4:30. Now, the other reason these shafts are curved and sometimes curved away, they're sometimes curved as well as up and down, but curved away, is because you drove these, generally, these gigs, with a collar with a full collar harness. In other words, there's a full collar. So if it were a straight shaft, it would poke the collar every time you go to turn, particularly if it got up in the air a little bit, okay? So these curve away so that the way the horse turns is actually, these are attached to his body, so the horse is trained to follow his head generally. So when he turns and he goes to the side, he actually pivots this carriage around. Does that make sense? So off from these things, he turns connected right here. That's why some of your modern marathon carriages, the shafts don't go to the point of the shoulder, because there's no necessity for that in combined driving, because you want to have the horse have the flexibility of coming around quickly, so they cut the shafts off right at the tugs here. Does that make sense? So all of you are seeing that. Okay, where's Fielder? Talk about your carriage up there. Tell us about it. Can you do that, or do you want Jerry?
Tell as much as you can.
You want me, Jerry? Jerry and I'll help you out. Go ahead.
Were carts, and they were mass produced as regular carts, cheap, simple carts. This is a little bit unusual from what I've seen, what I've read, what I've heard. The one thing that's unusual about it is the shafts attached right here. You take off two bolts here and loosen one here, and the shaft completely off, and you make it easy to haul in and stuff like that. Glacier was one of the people that was one of the main persons that negotiated with the railroad to ship carts on the rail car on flat cars, made it possible for them to have a better market in the East Coast and West Coast and everywhere else. And of course, all the other manufacturers joined in on that agreement he had made with the railroad.
What about the roller boats? Can you tell us about the roller boats?
The roller boats,
Yeah.
are they unusual?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, they're designed, they're spring loaded, so that there's a little bit more flexibility for a horse to move his shoulders and for the traces to move back and forth. And you can either, now on the ones I've got, you can either use French loop traces or keyhole traces. And these, you use keyhole.
Right here, yeah.
Use keyhole traces, and he fits it over this little shorter peg here, and there's a guide on the side, and as the horse moves, this has, can you see I'm moving it? It has a spring in there, and so it can move and give some flexibility to the horse's shoulder, whether you're in a full collar or a breast collar. Now, some people are under the misconception that you have to always drive with a full collar. You can, but I've seen tandems turned out both ways. I thought the full collar had to be on the wheel horse because they're doing most of the work, and the breast collar on the lead horse. But you'll see picture after picture where it's the reverse. Or they're both in breast collars, or they're both in full collars, or they're both everywhere. So I think people had more flexibility than what we sometimes think are our standards. So we never say never, say never. We always say maybe, sometimes.
This also has a footman's loop for the false breeching across here, as Gloria mentioned on her. Here.
Right, yes, yeah.
There's a tag on this cart that is not original to the tag. It's a maker's tag, his maker's tag, but it came off of a cart that I had that was made by Frazier, and this one says W.S. Frazier Maker Road Cart. So what it was a cart with a pole for a pair of horses, and so mostly what he made was a road cart type carriage.
But the name is on the step, the original.
And also on the axle, yeah.
This vehicle would have easily been appropriate to go out with a group of coaches or anything, because it has the fit and finish that a coach has with the seat, the 10 bead on the seat, and the seat rail, the driving box cushion, etc. is classy enough that you wouldn't mind turning this out with a group of coaches. Generally, you would have done it tandem if you were going out with four hands. But I was shocked because J.W.'s had this vehicle for 20, 30 years, and it was in various stages of storage. And when he began to bring it out, I was shocked to see the amount of finish that it had, and then to see that name on it, because Frazier built hundreds and thousands, likely, of simple road carts that they used to train horses and run to the grocery store. But it's a beautiful vehicle, well done.
It's set up also, if you notice the seats on that vehicle and this one, you can see that there's a wedge seat for the driver. And generally, Bill Long knows this, and probably some of you do know, sometimes we drive oftentimes in a semi-standing position. You know that? With our feet wedged against the toe board and sitting on the seat. It gives us more leverage, and you notice the back of the driver's seat is not in existence. This is called a lazy back, this one, and this is just the way it is on the coach. The box seat where the driver sits, there's no back to the coach's seat. Because sometimes Bill Long and Jerry and I, or JW, we have to really lean backwards and prop with our feet if we're going to control that wild and cantankerous tandem that's scooting across town, or a four-in-hand that's scooting across town. So this seat is set up very much like a coach body seat would be, or the driver's seat. So you've got more latitude to use your upper body. And people think when we drive, we only use our hands or our fingers. No, we use every part of our body going. Our legs, we use everything going. Particularly if you're going to drive a four, a tandem is much lighter, and we'll talk about that when we put the tandems together. What else do you notice on this vehicle? Anybody have any questions? Do you notice the suspension system? The springs? There are only leaf springs on the bottom. The top is like a dummy spring. It's just an iron that goes down to a leaf spring. A single leaf spring on either side. Jerry, you want to talk about your vehicle?
Okay.
You can see the same seat here, or generally the same seat, with no back where the driver sits.
I bought this vehicle out of a barn in Vermont, and it was supposed to have been a cocking cart till I got there, and then it turned into a gig. The gentleman that sold it to me had told me he had a cocking cart in the top of his barn, so I went to Windsor, Vermont, and this was what was there. It was all original, so I couldn't walk away from it anyway, but I call this a hill-topping gig, because if you may not have noticed it, but this vehicle is much wider than anything else here. The track on this is a full 6 feet, 72 inches. It won't even go in my trailer. That's one reason that Jimmy hauled it for me. One thing that you may have noticed is the difference in fabric. This is a tapestry that was used on some Brewster coaches. Some, I think Gloria has a Bronson that has this fabric in it. It was generally used on sporting carriages. They are, or did, reproduce it in Europe for a while, and I ordered it from Patrick Trovan to get the look that I wanted. You may notice the striping is quite different. They went through a period when there was a lot of chamfering on carriages where instead of the moldings that the Stanhope or the gig has, this has a chamfered edge, 45-degree edge cut, and they did this. Sometimes they called it infilling when they would put the stripe on that tapered edge, but it was striped a little different because generally you see the striping on the top of the shafts. Again, this is adjustable in the back. There, you pull a pin out here and you can drop the shafts down or up depending on the size of the horse. You always want to have a gig riding with maybe just a little bit of rise in this area, but certainly not going downhill in this area.
Just in case you weren't sure.
In other words,
This
you
is
would
the pin.
adjust it so that it was perhaps like that behind the horse. This has the English. This carriage was made by French Carriage Company, by the way, which made that one. Mm-hmm. And it has the pigtail, simple I call them, and the moving single tree, wiffle tree there. Wood dash. A lot of sporting vehicles had wood dashes. One thing that you may have noticed that's a little difference. I drive either by myself or with a friend rather than with a groom, and when you think you might need to jump down, an apron sometimes gets cumbersome to you. So a lot of people use these cross-lap robes, and they're secured in the middle, so when you get ready to get down, if you're in a hurry, you can just flip it over, get it off your body, get down, and you don't have an apron on to manage the horse. It's particularly nice if you're not using a groom, you have a friend up there that is not accustomed to getting down quickly. But that is suspended from a strap here, and there's a buttonhole in the middle of the apron, and we call this a boss. It was just there to hold the apron so that when you threw it, it didn't go away completely. There's some decoration on this carriage, and one thing about two-wheel carriages, they take up a lot of room in a carriage house, more than you would think, because many of our four-wheel vehicles are only 7-8 feet long from beginning to end. So they made this carriage so
If it were on a hard surface, it's on the sand.
it's too soft.
It's too soft. If it were on a concrete floor, that little peg that's in the back would hit the concrete floor, and you could store a whole lot of carriages. In fact, in the gig houses, they used to, the gigs were actually stored that way so they could get more gigs in a gig house. And
You gotta go your way. There we go.
Yeah. My crude vernacular, I call that a kickstand, because you remember your bicycle, you used to kick the stand down so that it would stand there. But a fun vehicle, and thanks.
The next vehicle we're going to look at is it's called a skeleton gig, and it's called a skeleton because can you see the frame? The body is not enclosed. There's actually a basket underneath the body there, where you can carry your supplies or your halters or your little picnic. So these vehicles that are very much just a frame, like a skeleton would be on a horse or your body, it's just the frame, and that's why it gets its name skeleton gig. Again, this, like Jerry's vehicle, has what we call Dennett springs in the back, or a triple leaf spring. There are two on the side and one on the back. The two on the side go downward, the one in the back goes up, and then there's a little bracket on the top of the rear spring that attaches it to the shafts, to the body, I guess, and the shafts maybe. But again, if you trace these shafts go almost all the way around the body. You never want to say the body is never attached to the shafts, because in the case of Dennett springs, there is an attachment to the body, but it's in the back. tell you about this vehicle. Jerry, do you have any other observations about it? It's
A lot
like,
of you that have taken the Carriage Journal for a long time may remember Lord Melville was on the front cover of maybe the first or second issue of the Carriage Journal, and he was driving a vehicle very similar to this with his horse topper. If you have the old issues, look it up. It's either the first or second issue.
and again, this was a casual vehicle. So there's 2 or 3 things I want you to train your eyes for, is looking at the springs, looking at the hubs, and looking at the tires on vehicles. Because if you notice, the first vehicle that JW owns, it's on iron tires. Do you see that? And the second vehicle is on rubber. This next vehicle, the Boston Chaise, is on iron. The Healy is on rubber, and the white rubber that used to be popular years ago, Brewster used to use this, and Healy used it also. They thought it lightened up, I guess. I'm not sure just how it came to be white or light color. Do you know, Jerry, the answer to that question? I don't know that.
The original rubber that they processed was white, and they didn't learn to put the black color in it. It was actually said to be an accident where they were beginning to try and harden the rubber because the white was so soft. And when they tried to harden it, it began to lose the white color. So they went on and made it black to hide that, was the story that I heard.
Yes, and if you do notice that this white original rubber is on some of these vehicles, you will see that it is more pecked up than a black rubber tire would be on a Carriage. So I think that's probably very, very, very true.
Who's the maker of this Carriage?
Healy. By the way, if you're any Brewster aficionados here, Healy's my favorite manufacturer. Sorry. Healy, my coach is a Healy, and I have a wagonette brake that's a Healy, and they just made beautiful, beautiful carriages. So now the other one is an English-made rally car. It's natural wood. I think we talked a little bit about it. One of the things I'd like to see, I don't know. My impression is the lamps on this vehicle are too small for it. Would you say that? Who's a lamp buff? And I almost would rather see those lamps on this vehicle and those lamps on that vehicle. What do you think?
I generally on a rally car would see more of a rounder,
Yes, maybe
less
a male.
square, less gig, and not so much of a chimney.
Yes.
This is a chimney type lamp.
Yes, or chimney over here,
Yeah,
and
I
maybe
would,
a
but I would
male.
think more of a little higher top to go up into the fender.
And maybe a male lamp, if you know what a male lamp is, it's
Or-
round.
Or with an oval face.
Yes, yeah, there you go.
More of an English face. American
There you
lamps
go.
have a tendency to have a round face, and English lamps have a tendency to have a little bit of an oval.
There you go, there you go. Now, when you have a carriage like this, well, first of all, with a gig, the way we adjust the balance on a gig is to raise and lower the tubs that fall from a gig back pad that has movement through the back pad. It slides through the back pad of the saddle. And to adjust the balance, because we're told with these gigs that you should have no more than 3 to 5 pounds download on the gig, on the pad, the horse's back. Does that make sense? Because you don't want the horse being so heavy on their backs. So what we try to do with this is we raise and lower the tugs on the harness to, after the person's in, or the 2 persons are in, to adjust it so there's only about 3 to 5 pounds. You don't want the shafts bouncing up in the air. You want them to settle on the base of the tug, but you don't want it so heavy that it provides a lot of extra weight on the horse's back. Because when we drive horses, we want horses to engage themselves from the back and actually elevate their back muscles and come up under themselves, so we don't want to restrict anything that comes across the saddle area of it, so that they can elevate that part of their back and move into the collar. They walk into the collar, okay? Okay, I think I said that. Now, up here, there's a different system. Because now we're going to take 4 passengers with us, maybe. And if we do, we have to do something more than just raise and lower the tugs. So in here, we actually have, there's a screw mechanism in the front of this carriage, which you can see a little later, which actually causes this seat to slide forward and backwards. So you have to kind of try these carriages out a little bit ahead of time, so you know your adjustment of your tugs over here, and you know how far to slide this seat forward and backwards. Does that make sense to you? Because we want the weight over the axle, and we want no more than 3 to 5 pounds download on the shafts. So that's critical in driving 2-wheeled carriages. Go ahead.
Can you make that adjustment with the passengers loaded?
Well, we tried it. It wasn't so easy, but we did it the other day, didn't we, Emily? I think we did do it. I think we did, because I went like this. I was jiggling it back and forth.
But normally you try to predict what.
Yeah, kind of. And if you use the carriage regularly enough, you'd know where it needed to be adjusted. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have a going cover cart?
No, I do not.
Because that has the ability, it has a gear system that allows the body to come forward and back
Yeah, there's
on a set
several.
of round rails.
There's several different ways to do it. You can actually move the whole body forward and backwards. You can move the seats forward and backwards. You can, with a handsome cab, you can put a passenger, the driver, in the back, so that there's no more than 3 to 5 pounds download on the tugs. So there's 4 systems we've described: raising and lowering the billet straps here, moving the seat, moving the whole body forward and aft, and taking the driver on a hansom cab, or putting the driver out and back. Okay, go ahead.
Another vehicle I had one time had 4 positions at the end of the shaft, at the rear.
Oh.
The yellow one does.
The yellow one does. Oh, there you go.
I say no more.
There you go. See?
Another way to change the pitch and the balance.
That's correct. Pitch and balance. Yep, that's it. Yep. Okay, yes?
I've always kind of thought that the reason that you see a lot of rally cars in very good condition is because that crank is such a pain that people put them away and don't fool them.
Maybe. I don't know. Could be.
I could never find 4 friends to ride with them.
Yeah, that's right. There you go. There you go.
I've run across 1 or 2 people that they get in and it's one crank and the balance is perfect.
Yeah. Well, we'll see today. We'll see what we do. What other questions do we have? Yes, go ahead.
What determines color of the vehicle, and what determines whether the vehicle has a lamp or not?
Well, Jerry, you say.
My vehicle would never have had lamps. That was a daytime vehicle. They followed the hunt with it or whatever they did.
That's
So
the
it
yellow
never
vehicle.
had brackets, never had lamps. And that's kind of the rule, is how was it used. Of course, many times in a formal situation, if they were out for a coaching drive and they had an evening meal, they were going home with lamps on. And I lit a pair of gig lamps in my carriage room about a month ago. I had never done that with the bullseye in a dark room, and it is amazing what the magnification is on that bullseye.
Like this one.
Like this one. And some had a full round glass, and it magnifies so much that it is actually really bright if you're looking at the vehicle from the front. And of course that was the purpose of the lamps, was that they could see you, not necessarily that you could see down the road, but so you could be seen by oncoming vehicles and horses. But the color is, as you see here, it's almost like your choice of colors, especially in gigs, because people wanted them to be colorful. They could be the vermilion-like color, the gold. You see a little bit lighter yellow sometimes, But I like the richness of this color. We call that an ochre color that is pretty popular. There were a lot of browns. You'd be amazed how many all black vehicles that were made, especially in certain year periods. You would look at the records and you would find that almost every carriage was the same color, order after order. So it kind of was a trend with colors. So especially sporting vehicles could be bright colors. And of course you always have some black or some other color with it. One thing that you have to watch on carriages, of course, is the leather work. Much of the modern substitute for patent is not very durable, and it looks really good early, but if you can, full leather, and then if you want it to be glossy, polish it and gloss it up.
Yeah, generally, there's some general rules of thumb. Generally, brighter colored vehicles are sporting vehicles. Sometimes more somber colored vehicles are city vehicles. Natural wood vehicles were oftentimes used in the country because there was just as much dust as there are out on these roads. And if you notice, the upholstery of several of these vehicles is a Bedford cord, which is either gray or tan. You know why that is? Because the dust won't show on it. But now if you go to drive this vehicle, it's got this green vehicle, so it was made for a little bit more formal occasion. And Emily's going to dress like a lady driving it this afternoon, and so it would have been something that you would have kept a little bit more tidy and cleaned up. But these Bedford cords in tan or gray, or the tapestry that you call it a tapestry, the material here that's on Jerry's vehicle. Do you see how the dust could get all over that and it wouldn't show? And even he brought it over and he said, oh, JW is going to have to polish his carriage. I don't have to polish mine because it's yellow and I've got this tapestry seat, and I don't care if it's all dusty. You guys will never notice it. See? So that's one of the reasons for some of the colors that they used was, and particularly natural wood vehicles. Like this one is perfectly appropriate. You see, the natural wood wouldn't show the dust. It's the same color as the wood, and the upholstery on the seat is built for dust. So there you go.
Any more questions?
If not, we'll go ahead. What?
You want to go ahead right now?
Yeah, we can go ahead right
Okay.
now. I think they're all ready. So,
We'd like to thank everybody for joining us online, live on Facebook. We're at the CAA Driving Weekend, and we will see you later. We're going to go harness some horses.